QuickBooks Online 2025, Navigating the Software Overview. Get ready and some coffee because we're learning how to save time with QuickBooks Online 2025. Here we are online in our browser searching for QuickBooks Online Test Drive, the test drive being the free option available to everyone offered by Intuit, Intuit being the owner of QuickBooks. The test drive already having practice data in it, making it perfect for practicing navigation as we will be doing here. So I'm just going to search for the test drive, look for results that have intuit.com in the URL because Intuit, once again, is the owner of QuickBooks, therefore giving us some assurance that we're not clicking on some spam link here. Then you might have to verify that you are not a robot, and then we'll be in the practice file. Remembering this is Craig's Design and Landscaping Services. We're looking at the United States version of the software, noting that if you're located elsewhere, you could use another version of the software, but of course the currencies will be different. However, remember that the double entry accounting system itself is universal, similar to math itself. Where differences come into play is the currency, but you can kind of work around kind of the different currencies. That's fairly easy to work with. And then there's going to be laws and regulations, particularly those that deal with taxes, that throw a wrench into the situation because those will be specific to specific types of locations. So here we are, we're in the Craig's Design and Landscaping Services. We want to start here by giving a quick overview of the outline of the software. How do we navigate around the software? In a prior presentation, we discussed general items with regards to the software being, in essence, an online web-based type of software versus an on-ground software or on your desktop type of software. So if you're moving to the online version from the desktop version, you're going to have to first get used to just the fact that you're going to be working, in essence, a website type of format. So we talked last time about the idea that we can scroll in and out, holding down Control and using our scroll bar to scroll in and out. As you can see up here, the size of the screen is changing. I'll usually go to like 125%. We talked about the idea that we can have multiple tabs or windows open at the same time, which is great. And I'll typically format that in my personal system by having our forms on the right-hand side, the major financial statements, balance sheet, and income statement. So I'm going to start to do this every time I open the software. That is, go to the reports on the left-hand side, and then we're going to be in the standard reports. We have the balance sheet and the income statement, those being our major financial statement reports, which we will be going into every time. I'm just going to right-click on the balance sheet and open in a new tab. So I'm going to right click, open in a new tab. A new tab will open over here with our balance sheet. I'm going to do the same thing on the income statement, right click, open in a new tab. It takes a little bit of time to refresh, but now I have the first tab where I typically think of my data input. I have the second tab, which will put my balance sheet in. We'll mess with the dates later, but for right now, we'll keep the default settings. I can close the hamburger on the left, and then on the right, on the next tab over, I can close the hamburger. We have our income statement. So every time we do something, I will typically enter something and then look at the impact on the end result, the financial statements, balance sheet, and income statement. All right, let's go back to the first tab now and think more about just how the layout is put together in terms of where do you go to actually do things within the software? How do you enter the actual data within the software? So clearly the middle point of the page here is going to be the display part of the software. And then on the left-hand side, we have our navigation tools on the left. And then we also have some drop-down navigation tools up top, the primary one being the cog up here. Now, the general way I would tend to think of it, the way I think of it is that if I'm doing normal day-to-day type of input, data input, then I'm usually somewhere on the left-hand side, and usually I'm looking at forms. The shortcut to the forms is up top. So we're going to be going into here. This has everything broken out by basically what I would call the cycles. So you have the customers, the vendors, and the team. Now, I also just want to touch in on the fact that some of the terminology that you will hear in QuickBooks is pulled in from the old QuickBooks or QuickBooks Desktop. So, and this is really important because terminology kind of matters when, of course, you want to communicate with people. So, and I want to just try to lay this out as we go through our system here, because when you're in the accounting world, you're going to have communication that you might come from a book problem kind of standpoint. People that have gotten degrees in accounting, for example, might use different kind of terminologies and whatnot versus people that work within the accounting department or bookkeepers, which are going to use terminology that might be more specific to the particular softwares that they are using. Many softwares having similar kind of terminologies that are going to have more, again, specific kind of names for what they're doing. And then you've got kind of more casual kind of terminology when you're interacting with the accounting department, say talking to clients, or when you're calling an accounting department or something like that. In other words, terms, for example, like a credit. If you think about a credit from a book problem, then we're talking debits and credits, part of the double entry accounting system. If you're thinking about a credit in terms of the QuickBooks software, then you might be thinking about an actual form that you're generating, which might be a credit type of form. And if you're thinking about a credit as kind of someone that's calling the accounting department or discussing like with a customer, for example, a credit might mean to them that we're decreasing, the amount that they owe us, for example. Now, there's reasons why all those terms are kind of related, but we have to kind of keep those different things in mind. So when we're communicating to different people, we understand what is happening. And so I'll try to touch in on that all the time. Now, in the old system, I'm just going to jump over here to the home page of the old home page for the QuickBooks Desktop. I'm going to bounce over here from time to time because, again, we have a legacy of the old system that is still being used in the terminology of the new system, and because it has this nice flow chart. This flow chart basically is still the basic flow chart of any kind of accounting system, so it's just a great reference tool over here. Now, if you look at this flow chart, you've got the vendors, you've got the cycles, and the employees. This is one way that we can think of, in essence, our accounting processes. We can break them down into what I would call cycles. So when we think about the accounting process in terms of what happens like in a month, we might put it in order of date when things happen, but then we also might put it in order of cycle, the things that are connected to each other in cycles. So the vendor cycle is the cycle that deals with us dealing with people that we pay money to. So our vendors that we're going to be paying money to, the people we buy inventory from, the utility bills and the monthly expenses, and so on and so forth. So you might also call this like the expense cycle or the money out cycle. Ultimately, money's going out, right? And then you've got the customer cycle, which you might call like the money in cycle. That's the revenue generation, revenue cycle, you might call it that, or the sales cycle. And then you've got the employee, or you might call it the payroll cycle. So it's useful to break out your thinking and thought process in these formats because it simplifies the way you're thinking of things, because you're thinking of things in the related cycles rather than kind of a hodgepodge of everything that just happens on a monthly type of basis. And so this terminology of cycles is basically still being pulled in here. As you can see, the customer, the vendor, and then we have the other cycle. The team is in essence kind of like the payroll cycle. And there's always this tension, I think, with the online programmers that they want to stay, some of them, they want to stay the same as what we've done before because consistency is useful. But then I think you also have this tendency that they want to break away from some of the old terminology now that they have a new layout, and some of the old terms might not make as much sense, such as lists and stuff like that. So we'll touch on that as we go. Now, the customer cycle here, these are what we call forms. So once again, the form term is something more specific within the data input software than you might see if you were talking about like someone that learned from an accounting textbook at a college or something like that. To us in QuickBooks, the forms are the data input forms that create the actual data input. So this is where we're going to put the data in that will create the journal entries that create actually the financial statements. And we can break these forms out by customer, by vendor, and then like the payroll cycle, in essence, are the 3 cycles of those forms. Now, these forms can usually be found more than in just one place. So in other words, you can usually find these forms basically on the left-hand panel here as well. And this would be the day-to-day kind of data input that we would be doing. Now, I just also want to point out that you might be thinking, hey, what is this, all this day-to-day input? That's a lot of forms. What's going on here? I just want to set up my QuickBooks files, turn on the bank feeds, and let the bank feeds automate everything. I'm going to talk more about that later. But if you have a very simple process, like you're a gig worker or something like that, you're a YouTuber or something like that, and you just get paid from a platform, that might be fairly easy to do. You can in essence do that. You could basically say, I want all the stuff to pull in from the bank, and then I'm going to use those forms, which will be basically deposit forms, which will be the increases to the bank account, and expense or check type forms, decreases to the bank account, and then just use those 2 simple forms to create the financial statements. However, we're going to touch on the idea that you're going to have problems with that anytime you run into complexities, often that complexity leading us and forcing us to do a more accrual type of thing. In other words, if you have to track accounts receivable, then you're not going to be able to do that. You're going to have to invoice and track the accounts receivable being an accrual thing. If you have to track accounts payable, similarly, you have to deal with a bill form and not just an expense or check type of form. If you have to deal with payroll, then we're going to have to deal with accrual kind of components and reporting requirements as well as taxes, all of which mess up the normal kind of automation process. If you're dealing with inventory, that'll mess things up. So those are the typical things. Sales tax messes things up also, or usage tax if you're not in the United States, right? So those are the things that'll mess things up. So what we want to do is learn the forms in general, which we will talk about in detail. And then if you have a more simplified process, then you can eliminate all the complexity and just do the simplified things, which we'll talk about later in the course as we focus just on the bank feeds. But if you jump to the bank feeds before learning the forms, then you might get messed up. You're going to pull in a lot of data and you won't know what to do with it possibly. So that's just something to be aware of. All right. So that's going to be there. Now, we also, on the left-hand side, we can find these categories. So if you're used to these categories, these cycles, vendor cycle, customer cycle, payroll cycle, then those are in essence on the left-hand side. And again, they kind of changed the name for them. Now, before I go into this panel on the left, I just want to point out that the online program has been toying with different panels over here. And they're just going to continue to do that, I believe. I think they went way too far, a little bit too crazy before, using very casual terms. And so when we went to this drop down over here, you could toggle between an accountant view and a business view. And they tried to make the business view kind of the default view. And it was too like cheeky. It was too, for a lot of people that wanted a professional software, I think was the problem. So they A/B tested it for a long time, and basically they're back to, in essence, the accountant view as the default view. Why did the other one fail? I believe it's because they used terms that were too casual, too kind of flippant, which weren't as specific. They weren't tied into the accounting language that's traditional, and they kind of almost felt like they were mocking the accounting department, the accounting process, it kind of felt like to me. So I don't know. I tried to get used to it, but now they went back. They're basically going back to this default kind of format using kind of more professional layout and language. But they might change that at the flip of a coin, right? That's what they do on QuickBooks. And if they do, everything will be the same. It's just that now they thought it would be cool to make all the names change or something like that. So it's really a superficial change because the double entry accounting system is the same. But now we have to, that's why we're going to update the course from time to time so that we can look at whatever the current layout is that they are dealing with. So the reason these cycles are important, remember if you're just basically building your books from the bank account, then you don't really need to deal with these centers too much because basically you don't need to deal with like YouTube just pays you if you're a gig worker and you get paid by YouTube or whatever. Then you don't have to really deal with them. But if you have to invoice the client, then it becomes important because I want to go to the customer center because that is where I'm going to track who owes us the money and try to follow up on the payment. So that over here, it's called the sales item. So the tab is sales. It's got the drop down over here. So if we go into sales, then you've got your tabs up top and the main customer is over here. So whenever we deal with customers, this is where we go. So, and that usually means we're dealing with customers most of the time with types of businesses where we have to do the work first, invoice the client, and then collect on the money. Or possibly we got a prepayment situation. They paid us in advance for work that we're going to do later. Each of those scenarios means that we can't just say, oh, they came into the cash register, they bought something, it's over. We don't have to deal with that customer anymore. I don't have to track anything in the database system. But if we have to track the invoice, then it becomes very important to track the customer information and will be in here a lot. Similarly, on the payable side of things, I used to call that, so you might call this the sales cycle center, or the customer center would be the old name. What about on the vendor side, which would be the vendor center? That would be this expenses. So the expenses over here is what we used to call basically the vendor center. And you've got then your vendors here. So this similarly, and most small businesses might not have as much dealing with the vendor centers because they might just be paying off the whatever comes due either with a cash or a credit card. In other words, you're going to try to automate everything as much as you can for like utility bills and electric bills and so on. And if I automate it, then I can just pay it as they become due using the bank feeds and automate the process. And I don't have to track my vendor information because once again, I don't have to actually deal with the vendors. I just pay them when they become due. Larger companies tend to need more tracking of the bills because what happens then is they're saying, hey, I have so many transactions that it doesn't make sense for me to pay the bill when it becomes due. I want to pay it as late as possible. In other words, if I'm paying a utility bill and it costs me $75, it doesn't matter if I pay it today or 15 days from now when it is actually due. But if I'm paying, $7,000 per transaction, or then it becomes significant. That 15 days becomes significant. Or if I have thousands of transactions that are happening, then it's going to become significant. That 15-day period is going to matter with our cash flow money supply as well as with the time value of money. And that's when the accounts payable tracking becomes more and more valuable. So, and then of course we have the payroll, and that's going to be the payroll cycle or the customer center, the employee center. Now the payroll, we're going to talk about and touch in on it. We have a whole nother course on payroll just in and of itself, because there's a lot of different options that you can deal with payroll. You're going to have to pay for payroll no matter what you do, unless you try to do it by hand, which I don't recommend doing, at least not in the United States, because there's so many laws and regulations, including those that have tax implications, that payroll has become kind of a specialty in and of itself. So either we pay for payroll, track it within the payroll center, or we hire a third party to basically help us with payroll, or we might not have payroll because we might just be a sole proprietor or something like that, which would mean that we don't have to deal with that. Or maybe you can get by with contractors, but be careful to make sure that they qualify as contractors if you do that. So those are the major centers over here. I might go into a little bit more depth on the rest of them, but the bottom line is day-to-day transactions will be entered either with the bank feeds, which that's going to be up here, the transactions. So now you have your bank feeds. So if you have your bank feeds turned on, this is where you're going to have the information pull in from the bank. And if you don't have to track accounts receivable, if you don't have to deal with inventory, if you don't have to track accounts payable, if you don't have to deal with payroll, then those types of transactions might be able to be more automated easily over here, although it still takes work to do the setup process, which we'll talk about in a future part of the course. But you can enter these items basically here. If you do have to track the receivables, that's when you go into the customer center, which is now called the sales area. If you do have to track payable, that's when you go into vendor center, which is now the expenses area. If you do have to deal with payroll and you're doing it within QuickBooks, that's when you could go to the payroll area. How does that affect the bank feeds, you might ask? Well, if I have to do it on an accrual system, the bank feeds will no longer be the item that will be recording the transaction typically, but rather I still pull the information in from the bank to double check that what I have entered ties to the bank. We call that reconciling, the bank reconciliation, whether you build your entire books from QuickBooks or you have accrual components, is going to be the most important internal control besides the double entry accounting system itself. In other words, even if you're a sole proprietor, if you just enter your data into QuickBooks, you have increased the legitimacy or the likelihood that your data is accurate a lot, like a huge amount, right? And if you also do the bank reconciliations, then again, that's a huge increase in terms of the likelihood that your data is properly formatted. There still could be timing differences and problems and whatnot, but those are huge internal controls to have a more accurate financial statement. And so we'll talk about the bank reconciliations later. So as of now, the general idea is the day-to-day input could be done with the bank automatically, and then with the data forms, which are broken out by cycle, vendor, customer, which would be sales cycle, expenses cycle, and payroll, and then to actually communicate with vendors, customers, and employees if you need to, given the fact that you have an accrual component and therefore have to, that's when you go into the centers, the sales center, the expenses center, and the payroll center. Okay, so then we have the items up here under the cog. So you have your different items up top. We're going to talk about each of these items in more detail when we do the part of the course when we start a new company file, because these items are going to be items that you typically deal with when you set up the new company file. So if I go into this cog, for example, we've got your company, the lists, the tools, the profile. Now, there's a difference if you're a bookkeeper, if you're an accountant, and then you say, I'm going to go work for a business, and they use QuickBooks. Then what's going to happen is it'll be like this system. The QuickBooks system will already be set up. So what you're going to do is you're going to go in and you're going to figure out what has been done in the past and how you can continue and be consistent doing the similar thing in the future, changing things as needed to fix certain things, but basically trying to keep things constant. That means the chart of accounts been set up already. That means you already have the QuickBooks file set up, and everything's already there. It's already up and running. So that's similar to the first part of the course that we'll talk about here. Then you might also be a bookkeeper, in which case you're going to set up the QuickBooks file either from scratch or from a prior accounting system. In that case, you're going to have to, or you might be in a situation where you're a specialist in fixing problems. Their accounting system is a mess. Nothing ties out. They've got everything's all messed up. So then you're going to have to deal with some of these foundational types of items, which will be like the chart of accounts. We want to get a more specific chart of accounts. We might have different users that will be using the software. This meaning you might have different people accessing the software, and you might want to give different rights to those people as they access the software to implement internal controls being more important as you increase the size of the business. Custom form styles. So the forms are the data input forms, but also could be forms that we give externally, such as invoices. So we might want to customize them for that, and possibly to help us with our data input for tracking purposes, the chart of accounts, which is going to be the first underlying foundational thing you're going to need to put together, because those are the accounts that will have the money going into them when we create the financial statements, balance sheet, income statement. Payroll settings, if you're dealing with payroll in the system. Workers' comp, if you have to set up the workers' comp. Get the desktop app. Now, this is that app. We might talk about this later because it's kind of cool. They've been working on this thing, but I still think it's not the default way that people are going to use QuickBooks Online. They're going to go online and learn this web-based system, which is probably the best way you want to do it. But the app is pretty neat, so I might look at it. Additional info, and then we've got the lists. Now, this term, lists, is once again kind of a hangover, a pullover from not just accounting in general usually, but the actual software. In other words, the QuickBooks software used to have the old drop-down lists up top. That's the wrong thing. It used to have the old drop-down lists up top, kind of like Microsoft Office used to have before they had the ribbon. And they used to put these things under the drop-down that said lists, right? So we learn this, we use this terminology of basically lists. Now you have all lists, you have products and services. Those are the things that we sell that are going to go onto the invoices or sales receipts. We got the reoccurring transactions, so we can make a transaction that reoccurs and automate it in that way. It's kind of a specialized area. Attachments, that we could have attachments that we're going to add like bills and stuff to our data input, which could be useful for audit purposes or for data input for taxes at the end of the year. Custom fields, tags, which is a way to help us to sort data. We have a whole nother course or section specializing on tags and custom formatting for that as classes as well. And then rules, and then you've got the tools. We can order checks. Most people are kind of online with electronic transactions, but if you're still writing checks, you got that. Import data, import desktop data. So this might be important if you're starting a new company file, which again is kind of a special area in and of itself, although we will touch on it in the second half of the course when we do our practice problem. Export data, reconcile, budgeting, audit, and so on and so forth. So we'll get into more of these accounting and settings items when we do the second half of the course, so that we can look at the settings that are the default settings when you first set up a QuickBooks file, and then see which of those settings you might want to change and when. So right now we're going to imagine we're in a situation where the settings, of course, are already set up, and we're going to keep them as is as we focus in on our forms. All right, let's just do it now. A quick other kind of look over here. Notice that up top we have this item up here they bookmarked. So if you go into these items here, you could make a bookmark for the items. See, we bookmarked it and put it up top. So if you want to put another one up there, you can bookmark it, right? And put it in that section. So now I've got this apps bookmarked. Now that's kind of cool because a lot of people like doing that, but I tend to not do that unless I really have something that's buried, because I think the format that they use is pretty good by default. And if you're communicating with someone else, like your accountant or another bookkeeper, your CPA firm or your tax preparer, then they're not going to know your defaults. So you might have this totally cool system you put together, but it only works for you, and anybody else that you're trying to communicate with using the layout is going to be confused. So that's why I try to work with what they give us. All right, so then we've got the dashboard up top. Now you would think the dashboard would be like a really important place, but it actually has a bunch of stuff that is kind of interesting, like information, and you can dig into it in more detail, but it's not really where you're going to go on a day-to-day basis to do the data input, because you're usually going to go into the bank and the transaction. So you have here, you've got your planner and your home page. You've got your transactions. This will be a key place to go because that's where your bank feeds are. You've got your app transactions, which that's a specialized area if you're dealing with like online stores. And we have a whole nother course or section on that if you want to check that out, because that's a specialized area that you could specialize in. The receipts. So if you're uploading receipts, this was a really like highly marketed thing before, but most of the time these days we're using electronic transactions. So I don't think this actual receipts app is as, useful as they kind of were hoping it or advertising it's going to be. But you could deal with the receipts here. I think we have another course or section on that as well. Our reconcile, so we have the reconcile information here. We'll talk about bank reconciliations later. Rules, we can set up rules with regards to the bank transactions. We'll talk about how to do that in the bank section, the bank feed section, which is after, let's guess, like maybe the third part of the course. Chart of accounts, this is one way you can get to the chart of accounts, which is the underlying set of accounts. And then we've got reoccurring transactions, which could be saved transactions to make them happen automatically, which we might have another course or section on that specialty area. The sales area, remember, is the customer area or customer center, where you have the overview. You've got all the sales forms. That's in essence, if you go into here, all the forms under the customer. And then we've got, what is this doing? Que paso? And then we've got invoices, which are going to be the invoices are the things we have to track because those are the things that might be outstanding that we need to find payments on. Estimates are things are only used if we have estimates, which you might have in like a job cost system, which we might touch on later in our practice problem. We've got the sales orders, and we've got the, which is a type of form within the sales process. We've got the recurring payments, if we're setting those up, and then there's our good old customers, and then the products, these being the things that are going to be populated, inventory and service items on the sales forms, invoices, and sales receipts. The expenses that we touched on is the vendor center. So you have the expenses over here, which basically have all the forms in it, meaning the forms under this section in the vendor center in essence. And then the bills, which is the important form because it increases accounts payable if you're tracking accounts payable. Then your vendors, which you can track who you owe the money to. Contractors is under here if you're dealing with the contractors, meaning when you have payroll, you might have people that you pay as W-2 employees. You might have contractors. Mileage, this is an interesting thing that we have a whole nother course or section on because you, if you're doing this for taxes in the United States, automobiles become a problem because you might be using a mileage method instead of the actual expense method. And so this might help you to kind of deal with that particular issue. 1099 forms, because we have to process the 1099s, that's tied to the vendors. And that's, again, in the United States, we might have to tell the IRS, basically rat out to the IRS people that we paid money to if the IRS thinks they're small enough under the radar so they don't already have their hooks into them and they're not employees, because if they're employees, the IRS is going to force us to do a lot more than just report the 1099s, actually taking out the withholdings and so on, which we might talk about later. Customers and leads. So this is going to be kind of a specialized area for customers, which we might have another course or section on this. You have your customers here again, and then marketing information. Now into it, now I believe MailChimp is one of the big mail systems that kind of houses the emails for email marketing campaigns. So you might be able to integrate this, helping you with your email marketing campaign with your customers with the help and use and integration of MailChimp, which is interesting. And then we have the reports, which we'll talk about in detail later, which is where we opened our balance sheet, income statement, major financial statement reports. The payroll, which is an add-on feature. You have to turn it on to use it. The time. Now, time tracking, I think we have another course or section on this because you might use the time tracking to help you generate the payroll. That's what most people first think about. But possibly even more important or used more often is time tracking in order to bill clients. If you're in a job cost system like a law firm or a construction company or even a CPA firm, right? You're going to have your staff doing work and you're going to need to track the time. And you can kind of do that pretty neat and in a cool way within QuickBooks, actually allowing the other people to track their time that automatically goes into the QuickBooks system and allows you to then take that information to create bills or invoices from invoicing the client. So I think we have another course or section on that. It's kind of an added tool that might be useful for particular types of businesses. Plan better and budget. Manage all your profit and loss balance sheet budgets in one place. So we'll talk a little bit more about budgeting later. Budgeting is kind of something that you would need to do. You can't just do it without the help of management, because management is the one that's going to basically tell you what changes are going to be made in the future typically. But we can put together a budget and then project what's going to happen in the future. And then QuickBooks is great about running reports, comparing what we budgeted to happen to what actually happened as time passes. Taxes. So we have the payroll up here, which usually deals with the payroll taxes now that we have to deal with in the United States. And the United States, we have a sales tax, which might be a state tax versus the federal tax, which has federal income taxes. And that could be handled using this kind of widget area down here. It's similar to it's a type of usage tax. So if you're in other countries, then it's quite likely that they're taxing, maybe not with an income tax, but some type of usage tax. So you'll have a similar scenario to what we'll do here when we do the sales tax if you're in that situation. My accountant. Now notice that you have different users that can access the software, which might be users that are going to do different bookkeeping items within the software, but we can also give the software to our tax professional, which is great because it used to be that I had to give them actual physical reports, balance sheet and income statement to do the taxes for income tax reporting if you're in the United States, such as a Schedule C sole proprietorship. And then I had to give them a backup on the desktop version, and that was cool, but it still was an issue because the backup, I had to get the backup and give them a backup, and they needed the software. But now you can add the accountant, which doesn't really account as a user, right, but has the same kind of concept of accessibility to the software. So now the tax preparer can just get whatever they need, and there's less calling and communication. I need this report and that report, more detail on this and that. So that's what's really cool about an online system, is that you can easily give not only reports, but the whole thing to the accountant and say, here it is, get it, do your part on this thing. It also really helps for the separation of duties, saying, hey, look, I'm going to try to automate everything on my side, try to do things with the bank feeds as much as possible, and then allow the accountant department, CPA firm possibly, a lot more ability to do year-end adjustments to put the books correctly on a tax or an accrual basis, right? So, which was a lot more difficult to do if you had to exchange backup files, or if you had to have the accountant actually physically go to your location in order to enter the adjustments, right? That became a problem. Now, this is lending and banking. So this is going to be like the PPP loans and stuff. So this is really, they're trying to help you with financing. So this is kind of almost like a sales thing if you want to take out a loan with them and so on. So it's not really part of, in essence, the process normally. This is our commerce. And basically it's saying if you have a Shopify store or some type of online store, in particular eBay, Amazon, or Shopify, you can use this integration. We have a whole nother course or section on that. And that's another specialty area. So if you specialize in that kind of bookkeeping, there's certain things that you want to basically understand for example, how you're going to deal with the inventory. Do you want to deal with the inventory pulling it into the QuickBooks system? Many people say that's possibly not the way to go, but rather integrate it so that you can track the inventory on the other websites possibly, and then pull in the information that is needed for your QuickBooks system, and then make periodic adjustments so that you can possibly and properly record taxes at the end of the year, which does deal with inventory components. In any case, then we have the apps. So notice that QuickBooks is integrating some apps as they merge together. So now they've got this area here with the commerce. If you turn this on, you're kind of integrating to some degree on eBay, Amazon, and Shopify, which are basically now they have formally kind of made the app within QuickBooks, in essence, kind of to do that integration. And we saw that with MailChimp, again, you might be able to tie them together because they're related now. But these are going to be third-party apps that you can then search for that might have more integrations that could be useful. You want to be very careful with the types of apps that you're going to be putting into the system and working with, making sure they're quality apps because they are third-party apps. And so they don't feel as secure to me as using one that is owned by the same company or within the company, but there are some good ones, and those apps will usually be specific to a particular type of industry that you're going to be in. So what we want to do as bookkeepers and accountants is be thinking, what kind of industry do I want to specialize in? Oftentimes, that's one way that you can think about it, and then think about what's the best system that I can do better than anyone for that particular type of clientele, possibly, and therefore I have an edge, right, on that particular type of client that other people don't know how to deal with as much, right? And some of those might be dealing with an app. So we'll touch on those concepts. That's a concept I'm going to return to all the time when we're looking at these different navigations of the software in terms of when this is going to be important, what kind of clients will this be important to, what kind of businesses will this be important to, when won't it be important, and when can we automate this system versus not automate it with the help and use of bank feeds. So that's the general outline.